The roar of engines above the darkened French countryside in 1944. Paratroopers leap into the night sky, their silhouettes swallowed by blackness, hearts pounding as they descend into enemy territory. The silence is broken only by distant gunfire, the promise of chaos waiting below. Now, shift your mind back nearly 1,000 years. Across the misty shores of England, dragon-headed ships slice through the waves. The ground trembles beneath the march of Viking raiders. Their axes glisten in the firelight as they descend upon villages, bringing with them terror whispered in legends. 2 worlds, 2 warriors, 2 nightmares of history. But here's the question: who would strike fear deeper into the hearts of their enemies? The ruthless Viking raider, whose fury was carved into sagas of the North, or the disciplined World War II paratrooper, falling from the heavens like a ghostly army in the night? Both carried death. Both carried destiny. But fear is different. Is it the primal fear of seeing a longship approach, knowing your world will burn? Or is it the chilling silence of parachutes unfurling above your head, heralding an invasion from the sky? Tonight we decide. What makes fear echo across centuries? What is fear, really? Is it the sudden rush of adrenaline when danger appears before your eyes, or is it the quiet, creeping dread of knowing destruction is coming long before it arrives? Fear has many faces, and across centuries of warfare, it has shaped the battlefield as much as steel, fire, or gunpowder. But if we were to stand at the crossroads of time, caught between the arrival of Viking raiders in the medieval dawn and the ghostly descent of paratroopers during World War II, which would chill our blood more? To understand this, we must first step into the shoes of those who lived through these moments. Imagine being a villager in 9th century England, awakened in the dead of night not by thunder, but by the faint, rhythmic splash of oars on water. You stumble to the window, heart thudding, and see strange shapes on the horizon, longships, their dragon prows piercing the fog. Before you can even whisper a prayer, flames roar to life, and men with painted shields and axes surge forward. There is no time to prepare, no defenses strong enough. The Vikings did not just raid. They erased entire worlds, leaving behind smoldering ruins and broken survivors who would carry the memory of terror for generations. Now shift to France in 1944. You are a German soldier stationed near Normandy. The night is eerily calm, the kind of silence that unsettles even seasoned men. And then it begins. The sky is alive with planes, the faint whistle of parachutes unfurling above. They drift silently, like shadows against the moonlight, until the shooting starts. Bullets cut the air, flares burst across the horizon, and chaos consumes the countryside. You do not know where they will land, how many there are, or from which direction death will come. For the Germans on the ground, the arrival of Allied paratroopers was not just a military threat, it was psychological warfare descending from the heavens. Fear in both eras was not only about the enemy's weapons, but about the unpredictability of their arrival. The Vikings struck without warning, with speed and brutality. The paratroopers struck with silence and precision, falling from the sky in darkness. Both harnessed fear as a weapon, but in very different ways. The Vikings thrived on spectacle. Their ships, carved with monstrous heads, were floating symbols of terror. Entire coastlines whispered of their arrival long before the first village was burned. Monasteries, towns, and farms alike fell under their axes. They spread fear not only through violence but through reputation. To see a Viking ship on the horizon was enough to send villagers fleeing, sometimes abandoning their homes without a fight. Their brutality was not just practical, it was calculated, designed to ensure resistance crumbled before swords were even drawn. Paratroopers, however, operated in shadows. Their fear was born from invisibility. No one saw them until it was too late. Imagine being a German officer hearing rumors that the Americans had dropped behind your lines, cutting communication cables, blowing up bridges, ambushing convoys. Panic spreads faster than bullet. How many are there? Where are they hiding? Are you surrounded already? This uncertainty was as devastating as any weapon they carried. The paratroopers didn't just fight battles. They disrupted entire armies by sowing confusion, stretching fear into every corner of the battlefield. But which is more terrifying, the known brutality of the Vikings, or the unknown reach of the paratroopers? One offers the horror of watching your village burn before your eyes, while the other leaves you guessing if death is already waiting around the corner. Both fears seep deep into the soul. The human experience of fear in war is universal, yet it changes with time. For a peasant in the Dark Ages, fear was personal: your family, your crops, your survival. The Vikings could shatter everything you had in one night. For a soldier in the 1940s, fear was strategic and overwhelming. The paratroopers were not burning your home, but they were unraveling the very order of your war, tearing apart your defenses piece by piece. And yet, what binds them together is the mastery of surprise. Surprise is the language of fear. When you do not know when or where the hammer will fall, every sound becomes a warning, every shadow a threat. The Vikings understood this. The paratroopers perfected it. Now, let us dive deeper into the battlefield itself. Picture a Viking raid unfolding step by step. Longships cut through the waves, landing swiftly on a defenseless shore. Warriors pour out in disciplined ranks, shields locking, axes gleaming. They move with terrifying purpose, first to the church, the richest prize, then to the homes, dragging out anything of value. Resistance is crushed swiftly, with brutal efficiency. To those who survived, the raid felt like a storm, sudden and unstoppable, leaving silence in its wake. Now picture Operation Overlord, June 6, 1944. In the hours before the Great Invasion, thousands of paratroopers drop behind enemy lines. They scatter across fields and hedgerows, many landing far from their intended zones. Yet chaos becomes their weapon. They attack convoys, cut wires, destroy bridges, and leave German commanders unable to trust their own map. By dawn, the Germans are fighting ghosts, shadows of men who appear, strike, and vanish. The psychological toll is immense. The fear is not only of being killed, but of being utterly outmaneuvered, hunted by an enemy you cannot pin down. Here lies the key difference in fear. The Vikings struck with fury to dominate minds through sheer violence. The paratroopers struck with precision to dominate minds through confusion. Both strategies carved terror into history, but they represent two different faces of war, one primal, the other modern. But ask yourself this: if you were standing there, caught in those moments of first contact, which fear would you rather face? The sight of Viking longships sliding across the misty sea, knowing that fire and death are minutes away? Or the eerie silence of parachutes drifting down under the moonlight, heralding an invasion that will surround and consume you? One fear burns your village. The other breaks your army. And yet, as terrifying as both were, this is only the beginning. Because behind the terror of the Viking raid and the paratrooper drop lies something deeper, the way fear itself evolves with time, adapting to the tools of war, shaping the very destiny of nations. But what happens when fear is not just about who arrives, but about what they leave behind? What lingers after the storm has passed? What is worse, the terror of the attack itself, or the silence that follows once the storm has passed? When the flames have died down, when the screams are gone, when the enemy has vanished into the night, what remains? Fear does not end with the clash of steel or the rattle of gunfire. It seeps into memory, changes how people live. It leaves scars long after the invaders are gone. But how different were the shadows left behind by Viking raiders compared to the ghostly imprint of World War II paratroopers? Step back once more into the 9th century. The Viking raid was never just about the plunder, it was about domination. When a village was struck, it rarely recovered. Fields were torched, livestock stolen, homes leveled. Survivors became stories, their words passed on as warnings to other towns and kingdoms. Entire coastal regions of Europe reshaped their lives around the fear of raid. Churches and monasteries, the very heart of medieval communities, were fortified not only to protect treasure, but to try to shield the sacred from desecration. But deep down, people knew the Vikings could return at any moment, from any direction. This constant dread hollowed out villages long before the next axe fell. Fear lived longer than the raid itself. Now, turn to Normandy, 1944. The paratroopers did not torch villages. They did not slaughter for the sake of terror. Their purpose was tactical, cutting supply lines, creating chaos behind German defenses, paving the way for the beach landings at dawn. But the aftermath of their arrival was no less haunting. 4 German soldiers, the morning after a paratrooper drop, was a nightmare. Bridges destroyed. Communications cut. Convoys ambushed in the dark. Nothing felt safe. You could no longer trust your orders, because the lines connecting headquarters to the front had been severed. You could no longer trust the roads, because mines might lurk beneath them. You could no longer trust the night sky, because every whisper of an engine above might mean more soldiers raining down upon you. The paratroopers turned the battlefield into a living puzzle, and every missing piece was an echo of fear. But for civilians, the aftermath told yet another story. In Viking times, civilians were the primary victims. In World War II, civilians lived in the crossfire. Imagine being a French farmer waking up to find paratroopers scattered across your field. Some were Americans, lost from their units, hiding in the hedgerows, asking for water or directions. Others were Germans searching for them, weapons raised, tension in the air thick enough to strangle you. To shelter an American meant risking your life if caught. To refuse him meant risking your soul. In these quiet hours after the drop, fear settled like a fog, covering not only soldiers but every man, woman, and child caught in the middle. Fear after a Viking raid was blunt, obvious, impossible to ignore. You stood among ruins. You buried your dead. You mourned what was stolen. Fear after a paratrooper drop was subtle, insidious, creeping. You were never certain if the enemy was gone, or if he was watching you from the tree-line. You never knew if the footsteps at night were friend or foe. Even when the shooting stopped, the fear did not. But which fear shapes history more? The kind that destroys what you love in an instant, or the kind that gnaws at your mind day after day? Consider the long shadow of the Vikings. Their raids forced entire kingdoms to change how they ruled. England, fractured into small realms, began to unify under kings strong enough to withstand the Northmen. Fortified towns, sprang up across the landscape, built specifically to resist raids. Even language and law were altered by the memory of Viking terror. The raid was a moment, but its aftermath forged nations. Now look at the paratroopers. Their landings on D-Day did not just break German defenses, they shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Soldiers who once believed in the strength of the Atlantic Wall now faced the reality that their lines could be pierced from above, behind, anywhere. Civilians who had lived under occupation suddenly saw hope, in the form of men who literally fell from the sky. Fear shifted. For the Germans, it deepened. For the French, it turned to courage. And yet, fear was never far away. For every village liberated, another was burned in reprisal. For every French citizen who aided a paratrooper, another was executed as a warning. Just as Viking raids spread fear through brutal spectacle, German counterattacks spread fear through calculated punishment. Fear became a currency of war, traded back and forth between occupier and liberator, between raider and victim. So again we ask, which is heavier? The charred ruins left behind by a Viking raid, or the uneasy silence of hedgerows hiding shadows of men with rifles? Perhaps the answer lies not in what the enemy did, but in how survivors remembered it. To this day, the word Viking conjures images of fire, axes, and terror. To this day, the image of paratroopers descending under the moonlight carries both dread and hope. Fear does not just shape the moment, it shapes the story. And stories, after all, are what last longest. The aftermath of fear lives in sagas, in history books, in whispered memories passed down to children. That is why the Vikings are not forgotten. That is why the paratroopers remain legendary. Their fear did not end on the battlefield, it traveled through time. But here is the chilling thought. Fear is not only about destruction or even survival. It is about power. Who holds it? Who bends it? Who uses it to control others? And that is where the true comparison begins. Because the Vikings used fear to rule by terror. The paratroopers used fear to dismantle the enemy's rule. Two sides of the same weapon. But what happens when fear itself becomes a strategy, wielded not just to frighten, but to dominate entire nations? When does fear become a weapon? What if fear itself is more powerful than the sword, more decisive than the bullet? What if terror, carefully shaped and unleashed, could win battles before they even began? Armies throughout history have wielded weapons of iron, fire, and steel, but the greatest weapon may always have been fear. And in this arena, both the Viking raider and the World War II paratrooper stood as masters, though their methods were worlds apart. The Vikings understood from the beginning that the mind breaks long before the body does. Their very appearance was designed to terrify. Imagine it. Warriors clad in furs and chainmail, faces painted, axes raised high, long hair whipping in the sea wind. To a peaceful monk or farmer, these men seemed less like humans and more like demons sent from the edge of the world. Their longships were more than just vessels, they were symbols. Dragon-headed prows leered at the shoreline, carrying whispers of fire and blood. When one ship was seen, stories would ripple across entire regions, spreading panic faster than the oars could row. In truth, the Vikings did not need to raid every town to hold power. Their legend did it for them. Villages surrendered without a fight. Tribute was paid willingly, simply to avoid the fate that others had suffered. Fear was their currency, and they spent it well. Now fast forward to 1944, and look to the paratroopers. They, too, harnessed fear, but in a different shape. They did not rely on spectacle, but on invisibility. Their power came not from being seen, but from never knowing where they were. Imagine being a German soldier on D-Day night. The countryside is alive with whispers. Enemy troops are everywhere, cutting through the hedgerows, ambushing convoys, severing communication. The darkness hides them, the fields conceal them, and every rustle in the brush could be an American rifle pointed at your back. Unlike the Vikings, the paratroopers did not need to burn your home to terrify you. They only needed to make you doubt the ground beneath your feet. Fear became disorientation. Fear became paralysis. And yet, both sides wielded fear as deliberately as a blade. Consider the Viking tactic of the shock raid. Their sudden strikes were timed at moments of weakness, religious festivals, harvest times, the dead of night. They understood that surprise was magnified by fear. If an enemy believed they could be attacked at any moment, their spirit broke long before the first axe struck. Now compare this to the paratroopers' drop zones in Normandy. Their landings were often scattered, chaotic, and unpredictable. But in that chaos, the Germans could never form a coherent defense. Bridges were blown, supply lines cut, and panic spread. The Germans did not know if they faced hundreds or thousands. That uncertainty was their undoing. Fear as strategy is not only about what you do, it is about what your enemy believes you can do. The Vikings cultivated their legends so thoroughly that centuries later, even after their raids had ceased, the very idea of them still inspired dread. In some chronicles, their attacks were described as punishments from God. Priests wrote prayers begging for deliverance from the fury of the Northmen. Imagine the power of that reputation, so terrifying that even heaven was invoked to defend against it. Meanwhile, in the 20th century, the paratroopers became symbols of a new kind of warfare. To the German high command, their presence represented not just soldiers, but an unraveling of order itself. Entire divisions were thrown off balance because a few hundred men had dropped behind the lines. Bridges and railways could be repaired, but confidence could not. Soldiers fought less effectively when they believed the enemy was always watching, always moving, always in control. The paratroopers used fear as a weapon of confusion, not brutality, but it worked all the same. Which form of fear is more effective? The fire that burns openly, or the shadow that unsettles unseen? History suggests both have their power. The Vikings thrived on visible terror. They left behind ruins, corpses, and stories meant to echo. The paratroopers thrived on invisible terror. They left behind doubt, hesitation, and the creeping suspicion that you had already lost before the battle began. And yet, fear as a weapon comes with a price. The Vikings, by building their legend of savagery, made themselves hated across Europe. Entire kingdoms rose in response, fortifying their lands, uniting under strong leaders, and eventually driving the Northmen back. The very terror that once broke their enemies became a rallying cry for resistance. Fear united as much as it divided. The paratroopers, on the other hand, faced their own peril. Fear is unpredictable, and when sown too deeply, it can spark brutality in return. German reprisals against civilians were often merciless, punishing entire towns suspected of aiding the Americans. Just as the Vikings' brutality fed cycles of vengeance, the paratroopers' shadow warfare provoked retaliation against innocents. Fear, once unleashed, cannot always be controlled. So what does this tell us about the weaponization of fear? It reveals that fear is not just about the enemy on the battlefield. It spreads wider. It seeps into the hearts of civilians, rulers, and entire nations. The Vikings used it to build their empire of raids. The paratroopers used it to dismantle an empire of occupation. Fear became more than a feeling. It became the very strategy that decided the fate of wars. But here is the haunting question. If fear is such a powerful weapon, what happens when it becomes too strong? What happens when fear does not just break armies, but reshapes entire societies? For the Vikings, fear reshaped Europe. Kings rose to power, fortifications dotted the land, and the age of small, scattered villages gave way to centralized strength. Without Viking terror, perhaps England itself would never have unified. For World War II, fear reshaped the very meaning of modern conflict. The paratroopers' drops demonstrated that no fortress, no wall, no line was safe. Warfare was no longer about defending a front, it was about surviving an enemy who could appear anywhere, anytime. This was a revelation that stretched beyond 1944, influencing how militaries planned wars for the rest of the century. Do we fear more what we remember, or what we imagine? Why do some fears vanish with time, while others live forever in stories, echoing louder than the battles themselves? When the fire dies out and the soldiers march away, what remains is memory. And memory is powerful. It can magnify terror, twist it, even outlive the very people who felt it. The Vikings and the World War II paratroopers both struck fear in their time, but the way we remember them, the way their fear turned into legend, may be even more haunting than the events themselves. Think first of the Vikings. Their raids were brief flashes of chaos, but their shadow lasted centuries. Monks in monasteries, survivors of burned towns, and rulers who barely escaped the fury of the Northmen wrote down their terror. They carved it into chronicles and prayers. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. Imagine living in a world where your priest spoke those words every week, reminding you not just of God, but of your enemy, an enemy that seemed unstoppable, as if sent by fate itself. The Vikings became more than men. They became monsters in the collective imagination. And so, long after their raids ended, their legend grew sharper than their swords. Now shift to 1944 and think of the paratroopers. Their landings were not written about in prayers but in whispered stories passed among French villagers, in reports from German officers, in letters home from American soldiers who had fallen from the night sky. They became ghosts in the memories of those who saw them. To the Germans, they were invisible phantoms striking from nowhere. To the French, they were angels of liberation, symbols of hope cloaked in mystery. Imagine the child who woke in the middle of the night and saw parachutes drifting across the moon. To that child, the war itself must have felt like a dream, as though destiny had literally fallen from the sky. Just like the Vikings, the paratroopers became larger than life, not just soldiers but symbols. But here is the question. What terrifies us more, the memory of what we saw, or the imagination of what we feared might happen? With the Vikings, terror spread far faster than the raids themselves. Many towns surrendered without a fight because they had heard the stories. Rumors told of villages wiped from the map, of children carried away, of warriors who could not be killed. The reality was brutal enough, but the imagination made it worse. Fear fed itself, becoming stronger than any single battle. The same was true with the paratroopers. On D-Day, many Germans had no idea how many paratroopers were behind their lines. Some thought they faced tens of thousands. In reality, many American paratroopers were scattered, isolated, cut off from their unit. Yet the fear they inspired through rumor and imagination magnified their presence. One German officer described the sensation as fighting an army made of shadows. The imagination, once again, outpaced reality. And this is where memory becomes its own battlefield. The Vikings, remembered through sagas and chronicles, became myth. The paratroopers, remembered through films, books, and veteran stories, became legend. Both exist in the space between truth and imagination. Both are remembered not only for what they did, but for how they made people feel. But there is another layer. Memory is not neutral, it carries emotion. Survivors of Viking raids remembered not only destruction, but humiliation. Kings remembered the shame of paying tribute, of kneeling to invaders. That humiliation hardened into hatred, fueling wars and revolts for generations. Survivors of paratrooper landings, however, remembered both fear and hope. French villagers remembered the dread of reprisals, but also the joy of liberation. German soldiers remembered the terror of being surrounded, but also the futility of fighting an enemy who seemed untouchable. The paratroopers inspired not just fear, but transformation. So which fear is heavier, the one that scars with shame, or the one that reshapes with awe? The Vikings made fear eternal by turning themselves into demons of memory. The paratroopers made fear eternal by turning themselves into symbols of destiny. Memory, however, is not only about the survivors. It is also about us, the generations who came later. Why do we still whisper about Vikings, centuries after their raids ended? Why do we still tell stories of paratroopers, long after their battles are over? Because memory feeds on storytelling, and storytelling is what keeps fear alive. A Viking raid told around a fire, an airborne landing shown in a film. These are the ways fear travels through time. And in every retelling, fear grows. Think of the sagas. They did not simply recount battles. They glorified them, magnified them, made the Vikings larger than life. Fear became fascination. The same is true with modern war films. Paratroopers in movies are shown as heroic, unstoppable, godlike in their courage. For us, far removed from the battlefield, the fear they caused becomes a kind of awe. We are no longer terrified of them, we are enthralled. And yet, behind every legend lies truth. Behind the Viking sagas were broken families, shattered villages, and endless dread. Behind the films of D-Day were real soldiers, young men shaking with fear as they leapt from planes into the darkness, praying their parachutes would open. Memory can turn fear into glory, but it cannot erase the cost. So again we ask, do we fear more what we remember, or what we imagine? Do we tremble at the stories told to us by survivors, or do we shiver at the shadows cast by our own minds? Perhaps the answer is both. Memory keeps fear alive, and imagination makes it larger. Together, they ensure that fear never truly dies. But here is where the comparison takes its sharpest turn. The Vikings left fear behind as scars carved into the past. The paratroopers left fear behind as a lesson, shaping the future of warfare. Memory of their terror became not just a story, but a guidebook for how wars would be fought in the modern age. And that leads us to the final question: what is the true legacy of fear? Does it remain a shadow of the past, or does it become a weapon of the future? That is where our story must end, but not yet. Because before we close, we must look at the legacy itself, the way the Vikings' terror reshaped medieval Europe, and the way paratrooper fear reshaped modern war. Only then can we answer the question we began with: who truly struck fear deeper? Whose shadow falls the longest? When the screams fade, when the smoke clears, when the battlefield becomes only a memory, whose shadow lingers longer? That is the final question. Because fear is not just about the moment of terror. It is about how long that terror survives, how it shapes the world that comes after. So between the Viking raiders and the World War II paratroopers, who carved the deeper scar into humanity's soul, let us stand once more on the shores of the 9th century. Viking ships glide out of the fog, their oars slicing water like a heartbeat. For the villagers who watch them, this is not just an attack. It is the end of the world as they know it. Their homes may burn, their families may scatter, their future may vanish in a single night. And yet, from these ashes, something larger emerges. Kings unify their lands. Fortifications rise. Armies grow stronger. Out of fear comes resistance. Out of raids comes the forging of nations. England itself, united under Alfred the Great, was born from the desperate need to survive Viking terror. Their shadow was not just destruction. It was transformation. Now step into the French countryside of 1944. The paratroopers have landed. The night has been torn apart by gunfire, the hedgerows alive with shadows. For German soldiers, this is more than a battle. It is proof that the war is shifting, that even the strongest defenses can be pierced from above. For French civilians, it is both terror and hope. The fear of reprisals, the fear of gunfire outside their doors, but also the first spark of liberation. Just as the Vikings reshaped kingdoms, the paratroopers reshaped a world order. Their landings were the prelude to D-Day, and D-Day was the beginning of the end of Nazi rule in Europe. Their shadow stretched beyond the battlefield, into the very future of warfare. But here lies the deeper truth. The Vikings taught the world that fear could control not just villages, but entire regions. Their reputation was their weapon, their legacy a map of fortresses and kingdoms built in defiance of them. The paratroopers taught the world that fear could be surgical, precise, a psychological strike as devastating as artillery. Their legacy was not fortresses, but strategies. Airborne assaults, special operations, the very concept of striking the heart of an enemy from within. So which is greater? The primal, fire-soaked terror of the Viking raid, or the modern, calculated terror of the paratrooper drop? Which shadow falls the longest? Perhaps the answer lies in this. The Vikings remind us of the raw, ancient fear of survival. The paratroopers remind us of the modern fear of uncertainty. One is the fear of losing everything you own, your home, your family. The other is the fear of losing everything you thought you controlled, your army, your defense, your sense of order. Both are terrifying. Both reach deep into the human soul. And yet, their legacies diverge. The Vikings' fear became myth, eternalized in sagas and stories, a symbol of the savage, unstoppable force of the North. The paratroopers' fear became history, eternalized in films, books, and monuments, a symbol of courage, liberation, and the dawn of a new kind of war. One became the nightmare of the past. The other became the lesson of the future. But let us ask one final question. If you were standing there, on that shore, or in that field, whose arrival would you fear more? The dragon-prowed ship that brings the fire of the Northmen, or the whisper of parachutes unfurling in the night sky, heralding an invisible army descending upon you? The truth is, fear has no single answer. It changes with the times. It shapes itself to the weapons of each age. The Vikings struck fear into the hearts of Europe for centuries. their legend still haunting us today. The paratroopers struck fear into their enemies for a single night that changed the course of the world, their legacy still shaping modern war. Perhaps then, the real answer is not Vikings or paratroopers. Perhaps the real answer is that fear itself is eternal, shifting, adapting, surviving, always finding new ways to haunt us. It is the one weapon that never grows old, never rusts, never fades. And so we close our journey with this thought. When you hear the whisper of oars on the water, or the rustle of parachutes in the night sky, when you feel the hair on your neck rise, when you realize danger can come from anywhere, at any time, you are not just remembering the Vikings or the paratroopers. You are remembering fear itself,